Thank you. All right, I'm done. It was nice talking to you. Once you get it, you're welcome. That's the end of the talk, really. All right, so it's good to be here. I feel I have to warn you a little bit. So I landed at 11:45 last night, picked up a car at 12 in Orlando Airport and drove 2 hours, got to bed at 2:30. But I'm here, so, that's to make sure you pay attention, if I could do it. So we're driving from Orlando to here, that part of the Everglades where you feel like you're going to the swamp any minute now at 2 in the morning. Anyway, so it's good to be here. I am from Miami. So I'm actually from the Caribbean. I'm born and raised in Trinidad and Tobago. Yeah, you hear that, yeah. Wakanda forever. I like to point that out, and I even tell my students that on the first day of class, which was last week, Wednesday, that it's okay to tell me you didn't understand what I said. My accent is still kind of thick. I won't be offended. It's just how we roll, all right? So I grew up in Trinidad. I did my undergraduate in Atlanta at Morehouse College. Then I spent 11 wonderful years at Florida International University doing a number of things, including marine biology, economics, but then also some research on teaching and learning, which we'll talk a little bit about today, which has led me to my current role. So I want to start with my clicker that doesn't work. You did warn me. I guess you're right. All right, we're going to do a quick switch here. Yeah, it turns out you have to put it on. So this is my expense, my kids. If you have kids, you know exactly what I mean by that, all right? They're 4 and 1. They are like my second job. They're a lot of work, but they're wonderful young men. And I always start my talks by reminding myself of why I get up and do the kind of job that I do, all right? There is a lot of rhetoric that you hear in the media, online, in articles. And we are, in fact, living in a special time, if I can call it that. But I do believe for all the negatives you can probably point out, there's still good. There's still a lot of good to come. And I think most importantly, we have a big role to play in the nature of that good. All right? So when I hear people say things in the media about race, about education, and you sort of scratch your head and wonder, oh my goodness, I can't believe in 2018 people are still thinking like that. What I want to challenge you is to remember they came through our classrooms. We gave them A's and B's, and we gave them degrees and said, go forth, you are now a future leader, as said by University of X. So then the question is, what role do we have to play, regardless of it's biology, chemistry, physics, math, critical race studies, whatever? What role do we have to play to engage our current students so that in the year 2048 we're not having the same stupid conversations? All right? So I want to introduce you to my other set of kids who introduced me, humbly, to thinking in this particular way. So this is the first class I've ever taught. This was at Florida International University. Let me just give you some context. Any STEM professors in the room? Say, hey. Okay. So likely when you were in grad school, like me, you were told to avoid the classroom at all costs. That the time you spend TAing intro to bio lab is taking away from the research you need to be doing and the publishing you need to be doing. And I took that advice. I avoided that bad boy for 2.5 years for my master's degree. So when I came back for my PhD and they couldn't work out the RA funding, I quote unquote had to teach. And it really was an incredible semester. I mean, I was awful. I went to the individual who was in charge of TA training, and I remember asking him, semester starts in 2 weeks or so, which is a problem already, right? what's the training to do to get ready for class? And he said, oh, you're a funny guy, you'll be fine. Best training ever, right? You'll be fine. So I wasn't fine. I mean, by my standards that I now know what good practice is, I was pretty bad. But these were a wonderful bunch of kids. They were very patient. They were part of an opt-in sort of honors type program called Cubic. So it is possible they had the resources to kind of blunt the bad teaching that was coming their way. But I think what was most instrumental was that we had these faculty meetings every other week for this particular program. And professors would just complain. Right? These kids today, all of them just want to go to med school. Nobody cares about that one species of tree that only lives in western Nebraska. Why aren't you excited about it? And they just couldn't understand why students only came to class just for this particular grade, just to get, this particular transcript that got them into med school. And so I said, well, have you asked them? These kids today, they just... So one by one, I lined them up in my office, which is, the shared space with 100 other grad students, right? But one by one, they come and I ask, so why do you want to be a doctor? Because I want to help people. I went to the post office this weekend and they were very helpful. You could consider that. No, but you see, doctors is a different kind of help. Well, what kind of help do you mean? And we keep going this back and forth over and over and over until eventually, not in all cases, but eventually I will get to, but my parents said. And this is the moment where the conversation changes. And I had some education to receive. Because what I found out later was that a lot of my freshmen and sophomores were being told by parents, by grandparents, by uncles, by aunts, the careers that they were going to pursue: medicine, law, engineering. Distant third, engineering. All right? And as the more I sort of kind of dig into this social dynamic, for some of the families, this wasn't just their child pursuing a career. This was the person who was going to be the economic engine that moved the entire household to a different strata. All right? So when they got a 6 out of 10 in a quiz, to us it was, well, they just need to try harder. To them, it was their whole lives falling apart. And once you started to understand that, the teaching process became a whole different dynamic. All right? So I want to ask you a question. Disclaimer, all right? I'm a big active learning person. That's how I teach. I love it. I support it, right? But sometimes we get into this thing where then everything in the world must be active. And a lot of times the speaker will be up here like I am now, and then we'll pause and say, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to do a think, pair, share, and talk to your neighbor. I have to admit, sometimes when I'm on your end, and they do that, I'm like, I don't want to share with my neighbor. Could you just wrap this up? I mean, you have 10 minutes, all right? So you have the option, all right? I'm going to ask you a question. You have the option to share with your neighbor or just think on your own, right? That's equity. All right, I want people to raise their hands and tell me what you and your partner or yourself came up with. Yes, sir.
Well, we said, we kind of agree that it will depend on the size of the class.
Uh-huh.
Coming from UCF, where some of our classes are very large.
Mm-hmm.
And then I added, being a lawyer by training, I'm a little skeptical of buzzwords.
Uh-huh,
so like to me, even picking up a book, a damn book and reading it is active.
Right. All right. Yes?
We were discussing that is any process, teaching and learning process, that allows the student to construct their own knowledge.
Okay. Oh, that's a very cogent definition. Thank you. Yes?
Any learning where the student is actively participating and engaged.
Okay. Can I take one or two more? That's not from the northwest corner of the room. Yes.
For my students, the way I approach it is active learning is engaging with the material, with what they're learning, engaging with each other, and then engaging with their community.
Right. Oh, definitely love that last part. She said engaging with community, in case you didn't hear that. So I'm with you, Enrique?
Oh,
Yeah. Not a big buzzword fan. And so when I was coming of age back in FIU, I discovered pretty early. So when I met those students, they really taught me that teaching was going to be a passion. I really enjoyed marine bio. It was a lot of fun. But there's a difference between something you like a lot and a calling. And I think I was fortunate enough to find that calling early enough in the PhD process that with the help of Dr. Axel Vega and the Teaching and Learning Center, try to develop some of the skills around teaching and research around teaching. And one of the things that had got to me during that process was it's beyond buzzword. It's like, it's an orthodoxy, right? So there's the term, then there's a list of rules around the term, and if you didn't do it, oh my God, you're hurting students. And I felt it sort of came to a head 2014, I believe this paper came out. So you might recognize this graph from Freeman et al. 2014, and you would see the quote I took directly from the paper about what the effect size of his meta-analysis showed, their meta-analysis showed, all right? Pretty impressive stuff. If you're going to write a paper on active learning after this date, you're probably going to have to cite this, okay? What you may or may not remember is in the same issue of PNAS, Nobel Prize winning physicist Carl Wieman wrote essentially an op-ed comparing, yes, you laugh because I did the same, comparing those who dared not engage in active learning doing the equivalent of bloodletting. In case you forgot what bloodletting was, I put a picture to remind you, all right? So essentially they thought that there was some kind of balance of fluids in the body, and if you had a disease, if you kind of drain some of the blood, you'll bring the balance back, all right? Thankfully, no one's really talking about doing that. And this is some verbiage from his paper. I'll give you 2 seconds to read that. I don't want anybody to leave this conference and tell others that Bryan Dewsbury said that active learning is bad. I am a supporter, I am a fan, I do it, I practice it, I train other faculty on how to consider specific methods. But there is a little bit of a cycle, a buzzword cycle that happens in Reiki. About every 6 months, somebody writes an op-ed talking about lecture is still fine. And then the active learning mob jumps in on the comments page, and boom, 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 boom for about a month, all is quiet for about 6 months, all right? My problem is that when you're arguing about active learning versus lecture, you are still focusing on content delivery, which is a really, actually, small part of the education process if you are teaching for meaning and purpose. If you're teaching people to live ethical lives, to consider their neighbors, to work with diversity, how much is those 15 chapters in Intro Bio going to matter in 20 years? How much is, I mean, if I use 1 click or 2, I mean, I don't know, it's fine. I'm sure one is better than the other, but how much is really, really going to matter? So today I want to pull you back and think a little bit about people who've been discussing this for decades before some of us in higher ed thought we came up with something fantastically new. And that is teaching for meaning and purpose, or inclusive teaching, is the degree to which you can engage the voice of the student in the process. And the ways in which you do that will determine the nature of your classroom. Elizabeth Mohay wrote this in 1985, that we don't teach subjects, we teach students. When you're talking about teaching subjects, you're going to get hung up on how do I teach transcription better than last year. That is very, very important. You should definitely do that. When you're teaching students, you're thinking about how do I help you become a better version of yourself once you leave this classroom. And what impact does that process have on me as an individual? So one of the things I didn't mention was when I taught those students, the thing that was so transformative about that class, I didn't know them. I was born and raised in the Caribbean. I spent 4 years in Atlanta. I didn't understand Miami culture. I didn't know the historical immigration patterns. And it's when I was forced to read about it and understand who immigrated when, at that time mostly from Cuba, that affected the ways in which they saw the classroom and saw careers. So once I understood that, I can start designing a class that both helps them see a broader view of science, right? Help them see opportunities beyond the narrow choices they were given, and probably most importantly, give them a sense of agency so that when it's time to have that conversation with their parents, all right, it's about things that they're actually really passionate about. So I'm going to walk you through, I'm at the University of Rhode Island now, and I want to point that out because what I'm about to say is specific to this situation, all right? I moved there in 2014 after I graduated. I teach an introductory biology class, one of the 4 classes that I teach, but this is going to be mostly about that. In the same way that I was new to South Florida, I was new to New England. Anybody from Rhode Island here? I know it's like a, wow. Had I not asked that question, you would have never known each other. New England's an interesting place. I like it, but it's interesting. In the same way I had a bit of a learning curve when I taught in South Florida, I certainly had things to learn about my new population. So essentially my pedagogy got divided into 3 categories, and we're going to kind of walk through them slowly. I had to get educated, all right? It's amazing the amount of denialism that we have, not just in New England, but in America, right? 20 minutes from my house is a city where the most slave ships were built that contributed to the slave trade during that time period. No one knows that. Not even a sign until about a year ago. All right? The communities some of the inner city communities that occupy around the downtown area was a product of a federally mandated gentrification scheme, all right, that are still entrenched to this day, from where we got a lot of low-income students. So when faculty talk about why don't they just try hard enough and these high schools are X, if you don't understand how those communities came to be, it's easy to make these sort of narrow judgments, all right? So part of the education is knowing who the students were. I read this book, Americana, if you haven't. It's a brilliant book. It's actually fiction, but it's about a Nigerian international student basically navigating the American experience as an international person of color. All right. Maybe about 40% of the minority students at URI are from Western Africa. So the ways in which she detailed their psyche and how she navigated that was very informative on how I work with those particular students. All right. And as an international person of color myself, I could tell you it's a weird kind of intersectionality having a non-American identity, but also phenotypically looking like a simplistically categorized group. I'll just leave it at that. I try to stay on top of my own biases. All right. If you haven't read the book Blind Spot, it's about the implicit association test, which measures in a semi-crude way the degree to which you may have an implicit bias about something. I retake this test before every academic year. All right. It's not you get a particular answer and therefore you are racist. It's a means to sort of check why you may or may not have that particular bias. All right. Whistling with Valley is a book I've read before, but since I teach in a school that's mostly white, and therefore most of the classes are mostly white, I do have many students of color who may possibly, not definitely, be at risk of experiencing stereotype threat. I don't want to make any assumptions. Do we know what that term means? Want me to go up? Yeah, I'll say it. So it's defined as the awareness people of any particular identity have of a negative stereotype associated with that identity, such that when they're in a situation where they are afraid of confirming that negative stereotype, the fear of that confirmation actually decreases their performance. So what the book is about is basically a summary of all of the studies they've done on that. So, and they've looked at some really interesting permutations of this. So white men in African American studies classes, females in physics classes, white men running sprints. Places where you would kind of assume a particular outcome. So it's a wonderful, easy read. Then I had to gather information. So I work really closely with my institutional research office, which is one guy. But he sends me a spreadsheet about a month before the semester begins. And that spreadsheet has name, ethnicity, high school GPA, SAT score, Pell status. Depending on the semester, I may ask for the clubs that the students were in when they were in high school. I want to be very clear about this. I don't request that information in order to create a fixed profile of the student, right? The idea is not that if they come in with an X GPA, then they're going to perform badly. But it does help me to kind of know what their academic experience was like up until this point. To support that information, I send them a 7-question survey. And again, this is before I see them. And on that survey, I ask them what they want to be when they grow up. Sounds silly, but it gets interesting answers. When last they did any kind of science, frighteningly a long time ago in many cases. What their expectations for the course are in terms of their final grade. All right? So you can kind of see in those questions I'm getting at what is their sense of meaning and purpose when it comes to 10 years from now? What is their mindset in terms of their belief in their ability to do well? So I'm kind of building this profile all before I see them. And then the final activity I give them is this I stole from NPR, Support Your Public Radio, right? So if you go to that website, there's actually a guide for educators on how to do this. So they have a series called I Believe. The prompt is just the words I believe. So in 500 words or less, no more than 1 page, you write the things that really motivate you the most. And boy, oh boy, do they open up. All right, I have 152 kids in one section, 14 in another. All right, I read every single one. They're really fascinating. All right, this semester I have people who buried parents from heroin overdoses. I have people who are working 3 jobs. I have people with parents in jail. I have people who haven't done science since they were 6. I have people who believe that, if they could get a C-, they'll be all right. It's amazing the degree to which they will dig into their soul if they know it's private. And so now when I'm standing in front of that class the first day, this is not just a random 150 students, and I have a generic syllabus to which I will just deliver with all of the active learning, whatever. I am thinking, okay, what do I do to make you believe that in spite of the fact that you may not have had that background, that you can still be successful in the course? When I assign lectures to listen outside of class and questions outside of class, am I being unfair to the people who have 100 responsibilities outside of their 15 hours? All right, we did a study 2 years ago, and we looked at the students who were working across the school, and the students who were getting the most financial aid were working the most hours. Because the financial aid is not complete, right? So if the tuition is $15,000 and you get $14,000, that $1,000 has to come from somewhere, right? Like no money means no money. It's not like, I'll get it to you next week. No, no money. So if good, thanks for the $14,000, but I have to go and find the $1,000 in a bar on the night shift, all right? So knowing all of that really is important for any of the activities that I prescribe. So this is one of the welcome videos we send them that I like to share with you so you kind of get a sense of how we work. This is before we even meet them. and there is no sound. Totally should have checked that. All right, but you can't hear, but I'll just tell you that this is one of my learning assistants, Aria. She's legally blind. She has achromatopsia. She could, I think her cones are bad. So that's her guide dog. And we initially had constructed this video to kind of get students used to the fact that there was a service animal in the classroom and there are rules around that. But I got such great feedback on people just actually meeting us before they actually met us that now we do this every year. And then the cool thing is once you remove the harness, the guide dog becomes a dog. So before exams, it actually is like a therapy dog. Like it just kind of goes berserk. And you know, a couple of semesters I've had students who struggle with anxiety. You know, we can put them in a side room with Ingrid without the harness, calm them down for 15 minutes, and they come back and take the exam. So you never know. All right, so now I have my information. I think I'm educated. I have some information about the classroom, about Rhode Island, about the students for that semester. Now we execute. All right? There's a bar we have to set for what it means to know something. And I would say that, you know, one of the reasons why I love teaching intro bio is because they're mostly freshmen. And the class is not even really about bio, in my opinion. And yeah, we do bio, but it's not about bio. It's about how to college. How to figure out this thing. How do you go from a school where everything was regulated down to the last second, where all the content was given to you on a printed sheet and you returned it in 2 weeks? And how do you go from that to regulating your time, right? Encountering material you've never seen before and being comfortable about it, finding new friends, being fearless to go and ask a professor that you need something explained again. Like the first 2 weeks, you know, one of the complaints that some of my colleagues make about active learning and adopting inclusive styles is when my evaluation goes down. And one of the things I think we try to work with them in terms of the student eval is really spending that first week and a half, 2 weeks building trust. If they trust that you have their best interests at heart and you are very clear on the things that you're doing and how it ties to their learning and growth, it's amazing how less they would hate some of the progressive practices. All right? I mean, it's quite a thing, and I think this gets back, and not to pick on STEM faculty, but just because I do faculty development with a lot of STEM faculty, this tends to be it. There's a kind of a plug-and-play mentality, right? So I have these 10 best practices, whether it's inclusion or active learning, and I'm just going to go Monday morning and do 1 to 8, but it didn't work. You said you published this, and did you get time to know your students? Did you know if that particular technique was appropriate for your context? One of the conversations that infuriates me in a department in my school, I won't name them, but it's, yeah, we had another year of 65% failure rate, so we think we're going to start a peer tutoring program. Where's the step where you collected data on why it was 65%? Or did you quickly go to the student deficit model that is clearly them, and this one thing you picked at random from the internet is going to work? All right? So really trying to get into their head and give them a sense of agency. Can you confidently explain to me how 2 amino acids undergo dehydration synthesis to form a dipeptide with no help from the textbook, with drawing a diagram on the board, with no mistakes? Can you get to that point? So I use Eli Review, which comes out of Michigan State. I don't know if you know it, but it's a method to do short responses in class. All right, so if you were in my classroom, you'd all write a short response. And then from my computer, I can anonymously switch your answers. So everybody will get somebody else's answers in this room, but you won't know who it is. And you give that person feedback. And then I switch again, you get back your answer, and you revise your answer based on the feedback. And the idea is, and they always tell young professors, one of the best things you could do in your early pre-tenure years is critique for a journal or be in a review panel. And it's the same concept. Your writing gets better through the critique process. This is just doing it at the undergrad level. we try to give much more opportunities for dialogue. All right? You may know of this as group work. What tends to be frustrating is one of those things where put them in small groups, right? Randomly assign numbers and everyone's in groups of 4. Do you not realize that when people are in a group of 4 or a group of 3 and they have to work on an actual complex issue, that's when they learn how to engage people who are different than themselves to solve an actual problem. You have a real opportunity in that space to teach some of these social skills that really build towards meaning and purpose. And it doesn't matter what class it is, all right? So when we do group work, yes, it's groups of 4, and yes, it's 156 divided by 4 students, but the groups are picked very carefully, diverse on many different levels, all right? We spend half a class talking about different personalities in a group and how you end up with a good product regardless of what your style is. There are group exams, group quizzes, major homeworks that they have to solve as a group. And they have counseling sessions so that if the group runs into issues, which invariably many do, they have an opportunity to meet with myself, all right, and talk about some of the issues that they may have solving that problem. So that dialoguing piece to me is really, really important because especially at a school like mine, it is so easy to come in as a freshman. It's a big campus. Come in as a freshman, find the group that looks most like you, thinks like you, parties like you, all right? Join that undergrad group. Go to your 15 credits a semester, if that's what it is, all right? Graduate in 4 to 6 years and actually have learned nothing except for mechanics and, reductionist stuff from the classroom. Haven't grown, haven't interacted with anybody who you disagree with, haven't learned how to manage conflict because we don't structure, whether it's in the classroom or outside the classroom, enough opportunities for that dialogue to happen. And then last but not, there's actually more than this, but I'm picking kind of my top 3. Multiple opportunities to reflect. All right? One of the things that class in Florida really taught me is this easy way you could kind of march to careers without thinking about what you're doing. You just take intro bio, you take intro bio 2, you take ecology, you take genetics, take MCATs eventually. Are you asking yourself why you want to do any of this stuff? And the kind of heartbreaking conversations I had in that space, what I told you about earlier, of people who really didn't want to do what their parents wanted them to do, and having to guide them through the process of both figuring out what that other, why was, and then having that conversation with their parents, I would argue was a much more powerful education than anything I taught them in ecology lab. All right? So we started this program. One of the things that we did to address that is called Confluence. And if you go to that website, you will see some episodes of it. We invited minority and female scientists from around the country of different types. They would come to campus, and instead of doing what you typically invite scientists to do, which is my protein molecule in 40 slides, they talked about their life. They spent about 10 minutes kind of summarize, this is what I do and this is why it's important. But the next 40 minutes, they talked about their life journey and how things that happened growing up impacted the choices they eventually made. Right? So we had Dr. Mireya Mayor, who is a Miami Dolphins cheerleader, whose parents told her that young Cuban girls don't become scientists, but she really liked lemurs. She wrote and got a small grant from National Geographic to study lemurs in Madagascar. She went, used that data to get a PhD from Stony Brook, and then became a full-time National Geographic explorer. Imagine what it meant for the young ladies in the audience to hear her tell that, who were having that same conversation with their parents. All right? So in my current class, they write this reflection, same 500 words, 1 page, in the middle of the semester. When I started back in 2014, there was 4 sections of intro bio. All right, so I'm section 4. Unproductive grades in my context is considered C- or below. So meaning that if you get a C-, you don't get to go into the second iteration of intro bio. All right. most of the sections, mine included, at least in that first, well, historically, it was much worse than this. Students of color were failing intro bio 3-4 times the rate as white students. Once we got to math and chem, it was like 7-8 times the rate. All right. The first semester, I think just getting to know the lay of the land, we weren't that impactful. By the next semester, we brought that failure rate down to about 11% for both underrepresented minorities and white students. And by the following fall, every student of color passed the class, even white students, 5%. All right. Since then, we average about 6 or 7%. This is not, I don't want this to be a critique of my colleagues so much, but there certainly became a culture of 20% is kind of normal. On average, 20% will fail the class. But my argument is it doesn't have to be, if you don't want it to be. You have to be a bit aggressive. You have to know who you're teaching. You have to spend some time getting some data. But that could be in the single digits. I pause here a little bit because I always struggle with this particular slide. I do a lot of inclusive teaching, faculty development. And not to pick on STEM faculty again, but I will. They really want to know a list of best practices. And there are certainly things that you can do on Monday that are helpful in your classroom. But I can't stress enough that this is not a greatest hits type of list. All right? The history of race and education in this country is complicated. And until you really get a full picture of all of the historical forces that have shaped not just your classroom, but your students and your institution, it's hard for me to feel confident that some of even the best approaches are necessarily appropriate. So I really, really impress upon you to commit to the journey. All right, some of these things I'm recommending here, they're not easy reads. All right, they're things you may have never heard of. And when you read the actual data surrounding it, it would make you see your communities a whole different way. I mean, it's kind of ironic a little bit. I don't know if I should say ironic, that Mitt Romney, former presidential candidate's dad, was essentially forced out of the White House by Nixon for trying to combat federal housing discrimination. All right? See, I like New England, but they have this sort of sanctimonious dishonesty when it comes to race, as if all this stuff just happened in the South. But we just settled redlining cases like 2 years ago, all right? Where the banks would actually draw red lines around communities where they wouldn't give loans to. These things are, this is not 50s, right? This is 2000s. And those are some of those same communities are where our kids are coming from. So unless you know, you can fall into the trap of, if you just tried hard enough, and not to say that, resilience isn't a thing and people should try hard, yes, but you have to know. All right, I want to recommend 2 of my favorite podcasts that kind of really gets into this. So, I mean, those 2, so This American Life and Planet Money are series, but those particular episodes, if you just Google that, especially 3 Miles, some of the best intentions of the Posse program and what social belonging means. So when colleagues who come to me and say, why are you holding office hours in the dorm? I say, well, okay, first of all, I teach 150 students and my office has 2 chairs. 2-hour office hours, what sense that makes? So if you complain that people don't come to your office hours, but if they did come, where would they sit? Right? So the dorm has 45 chairs, a lot of whiteboards, right? But also, I know, because I know my students, that for some of them, that walk from their room to my office is like the Green Mile. Right? I don't want to cuddle them until they get their PhDs, but I need to find them in a space where they can trust me enough so I can then teach them the resilience skills. So I can then teach them how to do this stuff on your own. If I just throw my hands up and say, you are who you are, you're in college, you're an adult now, that's your 20%. Who wins with that? All right, I went to school in the look to your left, look to your right stage, where my professor prided himself on 10% pass rate for biochem. For what? Like, what's the benefit? All right. The interesting thing is, and this may be a critique of my own community, STEM ed research. We sort of knew. I am what you call a discipline-based education researcher, where I'm based in a department of biology, but my research program is in education. And sometimes, and this is Dr. Enrique's buzzword comment, we come up with things and act like it's all revolutionary. That's been discussed in the K-12 world for literally a century. And so this idea of inclusion, and this idea of knowing who your students are, and this idea of knowing yourself is not new. All right? This idea of the environment, not just the content in the textbook, being important is not new. John Dewey talks about it. My friend and colleague Peter Felton recently talked about it again. I'm glad to see it make a comeback. And it has to be specific to where you are. All right? I thoroughly enjoy the work that I do around inclusion. But I do the work I do around inclusion so that one day I wouldn't have to do work around inclusion. Like if in 2058, I still have to get up here and talk to you about being inclusive to your students and getting to know them and understanding US history, we missed something somewhere. All right? And what you have to think about is the way your universities are structured sometimes encourages bad habits. So you can't wait till MLK breakfast to talk about race. You can't wait till diversity week, right, to get people informed. You can't just have students who want to feel a sense of belonging go to that one group that looks just like them. We have to find ways to infuse this in every part of the university structure. Because then what happens is, you go after the representation model, hire the one black faculty who ends up on all the diversity committees, is the one who does stuff like this, oh, and by the way, you have to do the same thing everybody else does, right? And then when they come to you about it, well, I don't know that stuff. Well, go learn. It's not going to be comfortable, but you have to go learn. The only way to reduce the cultural tax is for everyone to pay their fair share. All right? And maybe some of us happen to know this stuff because we've lived it or studied it. But if we're going to move towards equity, we all have to be a part of it. I will leave you with that. I invite you to email me if you have any questions on anything I suggested, any book I shared. I do tweet a lot, but only on race and education, so I'm not one of those annoying, like, spam tweeters. Thanks for your time. Enjoy the rest of the conference.